Video reviewing for chapter 3, for exam 3 is chapter 13. As an overview of the whole chapter, we talk about structure, conduct, and performance. Under structure, we talked about the types of hospitals. We talked about the competitiveness of the industry, barriers to entry, who pays for hospital services, what drives the choice of hospitals, and the role of advertising. When we get into conduct, we talk about management incentives for not-for-profit hospitals and what drives not-for-profit hospitals. And I will get into that in a little more detail. Impact of market competition on behavior, both the pre-DRG and post-DRG impact. Impact of hospital ownership. Is a hospital owned by the government versus for-profit versus not-for-profit hospital ownership? Impact of managed care organizations on hospital behavior. Impact of price regulations and cost shifting. And in performance, we talked about spending as a fraction of GDP. We talked about price inflation. We talked about whether we're on the flat of the curve in terms of medical inputs, creating health outputs, and that health production function. And we also talked about the risks of using profit to evaluate the hospital market. Let's get into a little more detail on structure. We talked about primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary hospitals. Remember, primary are just, basic diagnostics and treatment. Secondary, you start to get into cardiac care, dealing with a heart attack. Tertiary, you start to get into cardiac surgery and chemotherapy and some of the more complex things. Quaternary are the really high level, draw from a national kind of population, places like Mayo and MD Anderson Cancer Center down in Houston. So go back and review those four and how the market definition varies by type of hospital. The majority of hospitals, about 60% at the time our text was written, and it's growing quickly, belong to a system. Markets, in hospital markets, they're typically defined as MSA for the primary and secondary hospital tiers, and more than 80% of MSAs have hospital Herfindahl indexes, the HHIs, over 2,500. So they're very highly, most markets are highly concentrated. We typically measure markets when we're computing the HHI by beds or bed days. We talked about barriers to entry, certificate of need, and how that's primarily historical. We talked about building requirements as barriers to entry. Talked about scale economies of scale, and whether the empirics supported that. We talked about the learning curve, learning by doing versus learning by watching. So you want to go back and review that, and whether the empirics, which one the empirics support. And finally, what are the benefits of being a large system? So what we learned in the first 4 points is that there aren't a lot of economies of scale and scope, and on the learning curve, that learning by watching was equally as helpful as learning by doing. So you don't really need to be a hospital that is existing and learning by doing. You can watch and translate that knowledge into a new hospital. So some of these barriers to entry really are substantive, and some of them maybe aren't. But there still are benefits of being in a large system, even if it's not the cost structure that creates the barriers to entry. A large system has more negotiating leverage and is large enough to be able to accept risk in the new kinds of compensation methods. So there still are benefits of being in a large system. So you're going to go back and review that section. We know that about 50% of the costs for hospital inpatient admissions are paid by government, either through the VA or Medicare or Medicaid. And the government is a very influential innovator. The DRGs are a great example in 1983 when that prospective payment system went in place, and they moved from cost-based reimbursement to a fixed dollar amount per admission. We also talked in class about advertising and the importance of advertising for hospital systems. If the demand is price elastic, that is, there is a big change in quantity for a small change in price, that means the demand curve is reasonably flat, so that a small change in price will cause you to move quite a bit in terms of the quantity. There will be less advertising because of the increases in the cost structure. Advertising costs the producer money, and that pushes up the cost structure and therefore pushes up the prices they have to charge to cover the cost of advertising. So if demand is price elastic, there's less incentive to do advertising. There's a greater incentive to just cut your prices if you want to increase market share. On the other hand, because people are protected from prices through insurance, the elasticity of hospital price not quite so important because people aren't facing the full cost of coverage and the translation of the advertising cost into the prices. So there is quite a bit of advertising in the hospital market because of that insurance impact. Advertising increases the perceived value of hospital services. And product differentiation is important so that the hospital that is doing the advertising sets themselves apart through that advertising, and they reap the benefit of the advertising. If there were no product differentiation, that advertising would just generate the perceived value of hospital services in general, and other hospital systems would benefit from your advertising as well. Conduct. We talked about not-for-profit incentives, and I want to talk first of all about the theory of quantity maximization. I didn't show it to you this way in these graphs, so I want to talk to you about this. You're going to see in these that I've got continue to have these hand-drawn graphs, and I hope you can read them. On the left-hand side is the classic profit maximizer. This is our normal monopoly where we've got the demand curve and we draw a marginal revenue curve that's got twice the slope of a demand curve. And we look at the point where the short-run marginal costs cross the marginal revenue. When marginal revenue equals marginal cost, that's the key for a profit maximizer. So you'll see I wrote that down right underneath the title profit maximizer. I said marginal revenue equals short-run marginal costs. That's where a profit maximizer with monopoly power sets the output. And then you go up to the demand curve to read the price that they need to charge to get that much sold. A quantity maximizer, on the other hand, all they care about is just covering their costs. They don't care about getting any profit. So they set the price equal to the average total cost. So they go out, you can see that price is set right there where the average total cost curve crosses the demand curve, so that the price equals average total cost. And in that case, they're selling a lot more for a significantly lower price. So this is a theory is what would not-for-profit insurers do? Well, they would maximize quantity because the more they sell, the bigger they are, the more prestige they have. But if you actually look at these graphs, what you have to do to maximize price, you actually have a lower price. Or excuse me, to maximize quantity, you actually have a lower price. And that's actually not what's been happening historically. Remember when we talked about Chapter 13 and we talked about price inflation and hospital CPI, the price index, has been going up 3% higher than regular non-medical prices. So that lower price with the big quantity isn't really consistent with what we've seen. So that kind of debunks the quantity maximization theory. So the second theory of how a not-for-profit is incented is the theory of quality maximization. If quantity maximization doesn't quite hit our experience because we haven't seen, it doesn't justify the price increases we've seen, then let's talk about quality maximization. Because under this theory, a hospital will invest in specialists, technology, increasing their scope of services, anything that will create product differentiation and increase their market share, and push up their cost curves as a consequence because of all that investment, and that will increase prices. So that is another theory. But there are those who actually say it's probably a combined theory. It's probably both quantity maximization and quality maximization. So with the combined theory, the quantity maximization has you set output where price equals average total cost, just like a quantity maximizer would. But because you're making investments in quality at the same time, the average total cost curve moves up due to that quality maximization. You also see the demand curve move out because if the quality's better, then you would expect an increased demand from the marketplace. So you've got a lot of things moving here. If you look at this graph, P0 and Q0, that's a standard quantity maximization theory. So if you had that original demand and average total cost curve, the hospital would set the quantity output where average total cost curve is just barely covered and price is read off the demand curve right there where average total cost and demand cross. But when you have the investment in quality and the average total cost curve moves up, and at the same time, because the quality's improved, demand from the marketplace moves out, you're at ATC1 and D1, then where that average total cost curve crosses the demand curve, it's at a much higher point, and so prices have gone up. Actually, where the Q falls really kind of depends on the relationship and which one goes up more. It's not necessarily true that the quantity is going to be higher or lower, but you'd know that the price is going to go up because of that combination of quantity maximization and quality maximization. The next conduct topic that I wanted to flesh out a little bit more was the impact of competition. Remember, we looked at this before and after the prospective payment, or that DRG-based payment, went in place. Prior to the prospective payment system, hospitals were reimbursed by Medicare based on their cost structure, and so there was an incentive to inflate costs by maximizing quality and the size of operations. So in that pre-prospective payment system world, increases in competition led to increases in numbers of beds, in costs, in duplication of services in the market, and led to decreased efficiencies. After that fixed dollar amount per reimbursement, the DRG system went in place, there was an incentive for efficiency. And so more competition, if there were more hospitals competing to get business from Medicare and from other private payers, that led to decreases in prices, decreases in numbers of beds, and decreases in adverse events, because you don't want to have hospital readmissions and other things inflating your costs, and generally led to increased efficiency. Okay, the last topic I wanted to flesh out on conduct was hospital ownership, and whether the hospital is owned by the government, for-profit hospital, or a not-for-profit hospital. So we talked about the possible differences in operations and conduct of the hospital when the ownership was different, so you want to go back and review that. Remember, government, for example, maybe isn't efficient because they get subsidies for charity care and so on. So go back and look at your notes there. Just to remind you, what does the research say about this? So we've got these theories about how government hospitals and profit and not for-profit and not-for-profit hospitals might operate differently. The research actually finds very few efficiency differences. They find very few differences in quality between for-profit and not-for-profit hospitals. They also found very few differences in charity care provided between for-profit and not-for-profit hospitals. And this is distressing to policymakers because the not-for-profit hospitals get a break on their taxes and the benefit of that not-for-profit status because they are supposed to be investing in the community. And finally, public hospitals do provide significant charity care. They serve as a safety net hospital in many organizations, many locations. So because of this issue with charity care not being higher for not-for-profits, when the Affordable Care Act was passed, they put in the requirement for a community health needs assessment. So go back and look at your notes about that and what the community health needs assessment is and what not-for-profit hospitals need to do. So that is the end of the notes on here. The other topics on conduct and pricing were pretty clear and straightforward, and I think you can just look back at your notes and flesh out those topics on your own.